Okay, everybody. Hi, welcome to this FIIA seminar on EU strategic autonomy, views from Berlin and Paris on a more capable and self-sufficient Europe. It seems that we really have found a hot topic today because we had close to 200 registrations today. Obviously, not everyone is dialing in, but there's a lot of interest on this topic of EU strategic autonomy. So my name is Niklas Helvig, and I'm a leading researcher here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Leading researcher, not because I want to sound important with calling myself leading, but because I'm leading a research project here at FIIA focused on EU strategic autonomy with academics and practitioners from Finland, but also from other European countries, from Brussels, from Washington, D.C. And I'm happy that I see a couple of them in the audience, and two of the project members are actually on the panel today, Nicole König from the Jacques Delors Institute and Sari Rautio from the Finnish Foreign Ministry. So that's great. So why did we start this research project on strategic autonomy? And why are we talking today in the seminar about strategic autonomy? Well, the idea that the EU should become more strategic autonomous first started in the area of security and defense, especially crisis management. And the EU global strategy in 2016 included the notion that the EU should develop its own capabilities or should strengthen its capabilities to be capable to provide security in its neighborhood, also if there might be no support from the US. So it's an idea that started in the area of security and defense. But since then, it also affected other areas. For example, it is now very much also analyzed and discussed in the area of trade and industrial policies. And on trade and industry policies, the growing dependence on China and the rising competition between China and the US put the EU really in a difficult position. And it is also often said that the EU is facing an environment in which major players, the US, China, Russia, that those players use economic instruments and misuse economic interdependencies to further their geostrategic interests. So if you think, for example, about the US sanctions on Iran, the secondary sanctions that also affect European businesses and European diplomacy. If you think about US secondary sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, we see that economic policies, economic measures play a stronger role on foreign policy matters and can constrain the EU's ability to act in a sovereign way. But yeah, we started this project in the beginning of this year, and we didn't even anticipate, obviously, that there would be this COVID-19 pandemic, which underlined a lot of these trends of international competition and international dependencies. So it really revealed the COVID-19 pandemic some dependencies that the EU has in global supply chains, especially when it comes, for example, to the area of health. So this is another aspect that maybe we're going to be talking about today. So in general, there seems to be an urgent need to address this new international environment that the Europe is facing. And if we remember, for example, in a couple of weeks ago, Charles Michel held a speech where he said that strategic autonomy would be the goal of our generation. But what does strategic autonomy actually mean? How can the EU achieve this goal of more strategic autonomy? And these are some major general questions related to the topic. But there are also policy questions. On defense, for example, should the EU be more bold to develop its own defense structures, capabilities outside of the NATO framework? That is one defense question. In the area of economic and trade policies, it's the question, should the single market become more protectionist to help European champions to compete in a more competitive international environments, for example? So these are all questions that are out there, and people often turn to Berlin and Paris to look for answers for these questions, and that is what we are going to do today, and that's why we're very happy to have such a great panel here with us today. But before we turn to the panelists, let me just make two small points. Number one, FIIA, so the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, is going to publish a working paper on EU strategic autonomy. And this is like a bit of shameless self-promotion now, but I'm the author of this paper. And we almost made it for today's event to get it published, but only almost. But everyone that's in this chat today gets an exclusive preview of the working paper. A colleague is going to post it in the chat in a minute or so, and you can download it and read it after the seminar, because now you, of course, want to listen to this discussion and this great panel. The second point is, after the discussion on the panel, in the second half of the seminar, we will have a question and answer session. And for that, I would like to ask everyone who wants to participate to write a question into the chat function of Microsoft Teams, and I will pick them up from there when it's time to go to the questions. Please state your name and your affiliation when you put the question into the chat function. Okay. But now it's time to start, and we first turn to Berlin, to Christoph Schweikman. He's a senior defense advisor in the policy planning department. He has had many policy planning positions already in the Ministry of Defense in Germany, but also at NATO. Currently, he's seconded from the Ministry of Defense. And he also, I think, you have a background in think tanks, right? And you were for some time at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. So it's great to have you here with us. So what is the German view on this EU ambition to become more strategic autonomous? And what can Germany do to achieve this goal?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I hope I can answer it a bit, but also, of course, for being part of this very interesting workshop and for the great interest from almost all over Europe in what we have to say and discuss here. And I will start with a brief introduction as demanded, as suggested, and I could go perhaps in some more details in the Q&A round if so needed, and if I can actually provide more insights then. I think the topic of today is indeed important and timely, and we have discussed it a while already over the last years. At the same time, long-standing experts on the matter could argue that the recent interest in European autonomy is also a bit surprising, considering that the ambition to defend Europe with Europeans is almost 70 years old. If you remember, it reaches back to the Brussels Treaty of 1948 and the Paris Treaty of 54-55, which resulted in the founding of the Western European Union, an institution, of course, that is quite forgotten and hardly anybody remembers about it. With the Lisbon Treaties, nonetheless, the political substance of the WEU became part of the EU Treaty, especially in Article 42.7 of the EU Treaty, while the organization as such was, of course, abandoned. In parallel, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, still in shape, was founded in 1949, as we all know. This was based on the conviction that Europeans alone would not be able to deter and eventually fight off the Soviet Union. They would need the help and means of the United States and Canada. In many respects, I would argue that some themes of the 1940s, 50s are still relevant today. First and foremost, the military dependence of Europe on the United States and the American conventional, and especially, of course, the nuclear arsenal. What has changed drastically, and Nicholas alluded to that already, is that the international environment has changed drastically and also fortunately over all the decades. The world looks very different to the Cold War, and we expect many further changes in the years to come. In the perhaps happiest days of European history, we have seen the European revolutions in 1890 that ended the Cold War. Major parts of Europe were integrated into what became the European Union and NATO. And over the last years, we realized how the effects of globalization and digitalization transformed the international order and led to the rise of China and the emergence of what we nowadays call the new great power rivalry. When we talk about European autonomy today, it is behind this backdrop. And the ramification for Europe were already spelled out eloquently in the EU's global strategy of 2016. The global strategy introduced the term European autonomy as a necessity of the EU to promote the common interests of the EU citizens as well as its principles and values. It wisely places the EU's ambition to actively pursue the interests of its member states in the context of the rules-based international order and close partnerships with a number of countries and organizations, including NATO and the United Nations. Autonomy in the EU sense doesn't mean Europe alone. Referring to the field security and defense, the global strategy demands an, quote, appropriate level of ambition for Europe's ability to promote peace and security within and beyond its border, unquote. In Germany, I cannot say we are fine with this meaning of autonomy. But as you referred to earlier, we speak of European sovereignty nonetheless. The reason I would say is twofold. First, for our ears, and I know we have at least 54 years in Europe, the word autonomy has an undertone as if you want to be able to act alone, autonomous, without any others. But of course, we want to continue, and the global strategy says exactly that. We want to continue to cooperate with the United States or Canada, with Norway, Switzerland, of course, or the United Nations. And secondly, we think that the EU is providing EU member states a new kind of sovereignty, not in a legal term, but in a very practical sense. They will never have this kind of sovereignty alone. Germany is convinced that the united Europe is ever more needed in order to assert itself in the world of the future. The aim of a more sovereign Europe is therefore to remain an independent shaper of the international order, where the member states alone are not anymore able to do so. The potential to become sovereign in this sense is evident with our GDP, with our currency, the euro, for those who are part of it. And the area of finance and trade, we are on a level with US and China. We combine our national and EU resources if we combine our national and EU resources in Team Europe, many other policy fields would also be much stronger from a European perspective. It will be a strong force for our common interests and values around the world and in many policy fields. Innovation, standard and norm setting, humanitarian and development aid, climate, but also health, as we see in the COVID-19 crisis now, are cases in point. And of course, also technological sovereignty, where needed, is an important factor that we can get together. Of course, European sovereignty needs to include more strategic sovereignty in the field of security and defense. Here we have made significant progress, I think, in implementing the global strategy. We have now the PESCO and CARDS that are helpful tools in planning and organizing our armed forces in a much more coherent manner. The European Defence Fund, currently 7 billion euros for 7 years, will have an additional effect. I would have wished more, of course, but at least something. And at the same time, we make progress on operational aspects of European security, example given with the national, military and civilian planning and conduct capabilities at EU level, that could develop to a kind of European headquarter. Crucial for European success, however, and here it's not different to other organizations, is of course a political unity and coherence, and also more strategic coherence among member states. Without that, even sufficient resources wouldn't have an effect due to the relative small size of EU member states. I think in this regard, the work strand of the Strategic Compass, which began now under the EU presidency of Germany, and which actually might be finalized with the French EU presidency, the EU has an important role to play. Starting with the common threat assessment, it shall define, the Strategic Compass shall define the direction and the ambition of Europe's security and defense policy. Thereby, we will focus in crisis management, resilience, capability development, and also partnerships. The work on the Strategic Compass will also respond to the latest developments in international security, where threats and challenges, artificial intelligence, cyber disinformation, call for working interfaces between civilian and military responses. This is also something Nicholas has mentioned already. Why shall this endeavor become more successful? For example, in comparison with the former European attempts, including the famous Helsinki headline goals. Exactly because the first time since the 1950s, the geopolitical challenges repose the core question to European defense. Not what we want to be able to do, but what we have to be able to do seems to be the topic of our time again. However, in the 21st century, political analysts speak not only of the military, but they speak of strategic security. They also speak of weaponized interdependence, as Farrell and Newman, or connectivity wars, as the ESCFR and Mark Leonard, that describe non-military means of coercion and threats. It is about technology and standard setting, trade, and obedience to international law. It is about Europe's ability to become a much more capable and united actor in international politics as a whole. The question of strategic sovereignty can thus not be separated from the question of European sovereignty as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Thank you also for pointing out that strategic autonomy is also, and especially the word autonomy, is a contested concept, and that there is the risk that there might be a misperception by especially European partners on what we mean by autonomy. Does it mean that we want to decouple from the world? Does it mean that we want to leave alliances behind? I think that has been very much seen with some concerns by some of the member states. This use of the word autonomy, and that's where alternative concepts come in that you also mentioned, like European sovereignty, for example. Thank you also for pointing out the what you called strategic sovereignty. I think that's the term you used, but at least you pointed out that there's a need not only to think about capabilities, but also about the EU's strategic capacity, its ability to think strategically about its place in the world, and the main foreign policy threats and the means to act in face of them. So this was really an interesting overview of what we will discuss today, and also what's on the European agenda. So let me now turn to Paris and to Manuel Lafont-Rapny. He's the head of policy planning in the French Foreign Ministry, and he is a career diplomat with a strong background in multilateral affairs, but he also has a think tank background. He was at the CSIS in Washington, D.C., and he was the head of the Paris office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. So he has been a practitioner and a thinker in his past positions. So yeah, I think France also rather likes to talk about European sovereignty rather than strategic autonomy. But what do you think are the core elements of that from a French perspective?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. Actually, we use both terms, not totally as equivalents, but quite indifferently. I want to start with a paradox, and the paradox is that the idea of strategic autonomy, of the EU strategic autonomy, was adopted as a common goal in the EU's global strategy, as was said, that was finalized by Federica Mogherini in June 2016. And the funny thing is that the debate on strategic autonomy started after, rather than having been, at least it's much more intense now than it was before. Better late than never. So it's very good that we have that discussion anywhere, and not just Berlin or Paris views matter. So I'm very happy to be here today, and I welcome the opportunity, and I look forward to the FIIA paper. The idea of strategic autonomy, it was already present in French strategic culture before the discussion went to the EU stage. As we see it traditionally, autonomy is not independence. It's the ability to act by yourself upon decisions you've made based on your own rules. And that's not just a strategic definition, that's actually the definition of autonomy, of true freedom, that philosophers, 18th century philosophers like Rousseau or Kant had when they worked on this issue. So basically, it's meant as a key condition to take our destiny into our own hands, as the famous European Chancellor once said. It's an element of our broader international credibility. A bit more concretely, we usually look at it as a threefold idea. There's autonomy of information. You want to be able to have your own assessment of the situation, for instance, based on your own intelligence, on your own information. I think in Europe, there's a legacy of the Iraq 2003 crisis that informs the need for that autonomy of information. There's autonomy of decision. No interference in your decision-making process, no blackmail, obviously. And there's autonomy of action. You need the capabilities to act upon your decisions. And for instance, on the military perspective, you need first entry capabilities in the military domain. That's something that France is believes is very important. But you also need readiness and you need political will. And you'll see that there's a lot in common in what I say and what Christoph said, and I'm not surprised that it's the case. Let me come back quickly to the first point I made. Autonomy is not independence. The right way to assert our sovereignty or our autonomy, for instance, against secondary sanctions targeting EU companies, as Niklas mentioned, cannot be withdrawal from the interconnected and globalized economy. That would be too big a loss to reach autonomy or sovereignty. On energy, the idea is that we diversify our supplies, the supplies we need to procure abroad. It's not that we cut ourselves from those supplies. So it's aiming for autonomy under interdependence, not against it. It doesn't have to be, when you think in terms of autonomy, you doesn't have to think you're autonomous from people. It's not against someone. It's autonomous to do stuff, to look after yourself. That's how it is in our own lives, and that's how it should be in international life. Another point I want to make about the conceptual discussion is that autonomy is always partial, it's always relative. If you have an absolute understanding of autonomy, actually that would be quite demotivating because that's quite out of reach. And if you think that's even the case for the US, it's not just that we can't have an absolute vision of autonomy because we are the EU. In terms of military planning, since Christoph was talking about defense matters, US forces are sized and structured to fight two simultaneous conflicts, including one large-scale war. And that's even the case if you are the US, so it's also the case if you are the EU. The key consequence of that point is that what we need to have is a collective discussion at the EU level on what is our level of ambition, what are our priorities. And that's a starting point for many things. That's a starting point for any consistent capabilities development process from a military perspective. That's a starting point for our relations with our allies and partners. What do we want to be able to achieve on our own? Which means also how much do we want to be able to share responsibilities and what do we want to bring to broader collective action? These questions obviously also take into account the strategic environment. And I agree with what Christoph said on the evolution of the geopolitical context. So I'll point to another factor on that evolution of the geopolitical context. The EU was built on the idea that interdependence is good because it promotes stability, it promotes prosperity, it promotes cooperation. And our foreign policy, even beyond our neighborhood, was built as a consequence on the idea that we should promote stability and prosperity through interdependence. But interdependencies are not always symmetrical. And so under some circumstances, they can be turned into political leverages. And actually, we've been knowing that for a long time because that's what we've done. But we thought of ourselves as doing it in a very benign and benevolent and positive way. But not only do we currently see a world where interdependence are more systematically weaponized, but we are not always on the good side of the asymmetry. So connectivities are turned against us in a more and more frequent and obvious way. And you can think of a lot of foreign policy discussions of the recent months. Sanctions, 5G, migration, energy security, mask diplomacy, and I'm sure you have many other examples. So I've been using strategic autonomy mostly. I usually use strategic autonomy mostly when I discuss defense issues. On other areas, I would rather talk about European sovereignty. And I think words matter. There's a new buzzword in the European discussions, I think, which is resilience, which is not really the equivalent of what the idea under strategic autonomy or European sovereignty points to. We need for more than just resilience. We need for an ability to be proactive and to project ourselves outside of just the EU. Basically, European sovereignty is about being a rules maker rather than a rules taker. And I'm sure that the EU can agree upon such a goal. So let me take three non-military or non-defense examples about sovereignty. Digital sovereignty, for instance. Rising debate, data privacy, cyber attacks, 5G. As we see it, there are four dimensions to build such a European digital sovereignty. The first one, obviously, is security. We need to have our own capacity to protect ourselves from cyber threats, but security will also come from a more stable environment, including with rules and enforcement mechanism. The second point, the second dimension is norms. We all know that the EU has a major normative power. You can see the success of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. So I think that speaks for itself. The third one is innovation, because norms alone are not enough to actually have a say, have traction on that area. As someone famously say in the digital affairs, code is law. So innovation is pretty important, including for regulation and governance. And then there is the commons, which are the digital commons, obviously, which are the guarantee of a free and open cyberspace because they help containing both monopolistic private players and hegemonic powers. I'll take another example, economic sovereignty. Let's discuss sanctions. Sanctions is really a strategic problem for Europe. Secondary sanctions, we see it with Iran, but it's not just Iran. We had a quick episode about Russian steel. There are now questions about Nord Stream. And you could possibly in the future think of Chinese sanctions or other powers also trying for sanctions policy. So far, what we've tried was insufficient to tackle the issue. We tried to insulate our economic channels, and that doesn't work. And that's why this idea that autonomy has to bring more independence, has to bring more withdrawal from interdependence, I think is not the right way to address the issue. Coercing European businesses that want to respect US sanctions will not be very effective and actually is rather counterproductive in terms of a strategy. So I have this question. How come that on trade affairs, the EU is able to respond to a partner, for instance, a major partner from the other side of the Atlantic, who raised tariffs on EU goods, and we respond to that by adopting countermeasures? And we don't do that because we want to fight with the US or because we want to escalate into a trade war. Actually, it's the contrary. We do that because we want to deter such a policy. And we want to get back to a negotiated approach to our disagreement. And the strange thing is that this that we do on trade, countermeasures to get back to discussion rather than coercion, is something that we can't seem to be able to agree upon on foreign and security policy issues. I think we have the instruments to do it. It really is about getting to the decision to do it. My last example is about health sovereignty. That's one clear lesson from the current crisis. I'll go quickly, but there are ideas going around about a robust health industry, which would be capable of researching and developing, for instance, vaccinations. You need strategic stockpiles to protect against supply chains interruptions. You need a European equivalent to what the US have with their BARDA, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, which basically is a major interlocutor to the pharmaceutical industry. And this is already part not only of the Franco-German agreement that was behind the recovery plan initiative, but it's now actually a proposal by Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission from the State of the European Union speech. So what does that tell us? What is it that we need to do now? First, it's good that we have a debate, as I said, and words and concept matters, but it would be even better to continue to work, to act upon that goal. Second, we have a few efforts to do on the economic side. I agree with what Christoph said on the defense part, but you've heard me talking a lot about technology, research development, market power. This is something that we need to strengthen. And as we did achieve progress on the defense side, I would very much agree with what Christoph said also on that. We actually need progress on the foreign policy side. And I think one important discussion that is developing these days and that matter for strategic autonomy or European sovereignty is solidarity. And I've mentioned it, we need a discussion on the level of ambition that we want to pursue. And I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for your points. I had some connection problems, that's why I switched now to a different device here, but I could follow your whole presentation. And I must say, it was very comprehensive. I especially like the point that you made that we shouldn't think about strategic autonomy only as something that concerns our resilience, but also in the way that it is about EU's ability to also shape the global agenda regarding our norms and our interests. And I think this global dimension is something that has come very much to the forefront in recent discussions. Also, you mentioned digital norms and the digital agenda, but I guess also when it comes to the green transformation and European climate policy, I think this is a very important aspect where the EU wants to shape really the global agenda. I want to remind everyone again that if you have questions for the Q&A later, you can already start typing them into the chat function. But now, first, we're going to turn to Sari Rautio from the Finnish Foreign Ministry. She's Director for Security Policy and Crisis Management in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Helsinki. And before that, she held high-level positions in Helsinki as well as in the permanent representation in Brussels. And her earlier assignments were on a large range of policies, security policy, UN policies, and also with regards to the Middle East. So it's great to have you here today, Sari. And well, I mean, Finland is traditionally strongly supporting the EU and the EU's global role. But it also has its own distinct views regarding security policy and also regarding some of the policies when it comes to trade and industry. So I'm really interested what your reactions are to what you heard from your colleagues from Berlin and Paris.
Well, thank you, Niklas, and thanks to FIIA for organizing this event. I just checked that you hear me properly before I continue.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Very well. Yes, so thanks for organizing this event. Thanks for inviting me as a commentator. I think this kind of discussions really help us being quite analytical about the objective and the content of strategic autonomy, and also to be a little bit less emotional on this issue. I think that in the past years there have been some emotions also involved in this discussion, and of course relating to the question on whether we are talking about strategic autonomy to do things, or rather strategic autonomy from somebody or something. So thanks for the event. Thanks also to Christoph and Manuel for the really thought-provoking interventions, both on the evolution of the concept and also of the elements of the concept, plus the kind of the vision on where we are going. What are the next steps when we want to ensure the strategic autonomy of the EU. Niklas already referred to Finnish long-term support for the EU and EU as a security actor. So I start from there, from the Finnish thinking. And I start with saying that for Finland, the EU is and has been since the beginning, since our membership from 1995, a security community. We have since the beginning emphasized the need for the EU to have the tools and the capabilities to be a strong security actor in Europe, but also in Europe's neighborhood. But not only that, not only a security actor, what we also have really advocated for is that the security community means that we have a cohesion within the EU. We are able to make decisions together, and we are able to act together. And this very much is actually a continuation to what Manuel finished with, really the solidarity and the cohesion within the EU. Only this way we can be a significant and effective global actor. So Finland is all for EU strategic autonomy, and our emphasis is very much on the EU's responsibility, EU's ability, and EU's capability to be an autonomous actor. We have less emphasis on the question from whom do we have this autonomy, because we also very much want to see the EU to act with the partners when possible. Of course, as Christoph and Manuel have defined in their interventions, the challenge here is that the goal is moving all the time. If earlier strategic autonomy was defined or was referring to the independent capacity to run crisis management operations, and that was the push for the CSDP policies to be built. Now the new or newly revealed dependencies actually complicate the picture a lot, and they force the EU to pursue strategic autonomy with tools from different policy sectors. And this is the challenge at the moment. The traditional definition of strategic autonomy has been more focused on security and defense and on the question of autonomy from. But I would really advocate for moving towards the broader definition, as Niklas has also been referring to, whether we're talking about the narrower or broader definition of the terminology. And I think here the von der Leyen Commission has also been very clear that this Commission is really striving for EU's open strategic autonomy in all policy fields, not only on security and defense. There are certain risks with using the term strategic autonomy for all policy fields. But on the other hand, maybe this label would help the EU to have more foresight and to build beforehand policies that really avoid unhealthy dependencies in the first place. Because now too often the EU actually finds itself in a situation where it has lost strategic autonomy or has lost chance of reaching the strategic autonomy before we even really set the target of strategic autonomy. Let's take the examples of 5G, the critical raw materials, and also the medical and protective gear manufacturing. The unhealthy dependencies were revealed to us in a sense too late. We didn't really, we were not really forward-coming enough to make sure that we are independent enough in these fields. By the way, here I can't help saying, but I think I would rather use the term strategic autonomy. I think the words sovereignty and autonomy have different connotations in different languages, but strategic autonomy seems to be a more pragmatic term. Sovereignty is very much terminology that is loaded with interpretations from international law and the breach of sovereignty. So as you have heard, I very much stick to the terminology of strategic autonomy. So it's very much obvious that we need to foster EU's global strategic autonomy beyond security and defense, but we should, at the same time, we should not lose the sight of the need to still develop certain aspects of security and defense. Here, the strategic autonomy is more a journey than a destination. So it's a process where step by step progress has been made. If you look at the number of successful CSDP operations that we have had and have at the moment, operations like Atalanta, where we have really displaced autonomy, all the work we have done on the structures, the planning, command and control structures, all the work we have done on EU's financing ability in what comes to the defense sector, but also to partners, security sector. So we really can see progress towards the goal of strategic autonomy. But at the same time, we have serious challenges in filling the capability gaps in EU civilian and military CSDP missions and operations. And if we are not able to fill our own missions and operations, it's really not very credible to talk about building other capabilities towards the goal of strategic autonomy. And here the strategic compass should really be harnessed both for the strategic debate and at the same time for the convergence of EU's capacities, both in protecting Europe and as being a security provider. EU's certain lack of coherence across policy sectors is, of course, the major challenge. And maybe one way to bring more coherence across the policy sectors would be to have more similar kind of toolboxes that we were able to develop on 5G. There was a common risk assessment of all the member states, and based on that we were able to develop a toolbox that really gives very strong guidance for EU member states on how they can, with their national legislation or national mechanisms, really bring all the member states to a level where we do have high cybersecurity of the 5G networks. Maybe we should now look at other sectors or other technologies where we would need similar kind of toolboxes. But really, I think there are no. I have no one policy field or one toolbox in mind in how to really ensure this global strategic autonomy for the EU. But as also stated by Christoph and Manuel, through their examples, we actually have several fields of action that we need to address all if we really want to reach a strategic autonomy for the EU. And it's not something that we can do at one go. As I said in the beginning, the goal is moving all the time, and we really need to be vigilant. And here, maybe the word really is strategic rather than autonomy. Thank you.
thank you so much, Sari, for your comments. I think especially the point that you made about the 5G toolbox and presenting this as a positive example, how in a practical way the EU can go about this issue of strategic autonomy and can bring the EU level, but also the member state level together in tackling certain policy challenges. I think that is very, very much appreciated to have this particular example. I also liked your last point that it's difficult actually to just say we concentrate on a certain area, but that we have to move on a whole range of areas in order to advance strategic autonomy. And you mentioned also before that this has to be done in an integrated way, so that there should be an integrated approach, and it's difficult to just look at all these fields individually, but it has to be done in an integrated way. So, but I want to give the floor to Nicole Koenig from the Jacques Delors Institute. So the Jacques Delors Institute is a think tank, which is, you can say more about it, but it's a Franco-German institution in a certain way. And you have been doing research on EU foreign and security policy and the EU as a global actor for a long time. So I'm really interested in your perspective on what has been said so far today, and how much is really new about this discussion that we are having today, or is that something that reappeared already before, and what can we learn from that? So I'm looking forward to your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Niklas. Thank you also to FIIA for organizing this round. And I was carefully listening to all of your inputs, which I found very interesting. What I would do is to briefly, to actually focus on the narrower meaning, so on the security field, on the one hand, because I know that area best, and on the other hand, because I somewhat agree with Manuel that the economic side raises different challenges and different issues. And the debates are also on the security debate is much older, as we've heard from Christoph, than perhaps this economic debate, open strategic autonomy in trade and so on. And I would also like to, because we are, this seminar is called Views from Berlin and Paris, and as Niklas pointed out, we are a think tank based in Berlin, but with a strong Franco-German dimension as well. I would like to maybe point out some Franco-German differences when it comes to strategic autonomy. So first of all, I really want to start with the paradox that Manuel raised. So we had this term of strategic autonomy in the global strategy, and only after have we seen a big discussion about that. And the reason why I think we have had this discussion is that it's very hard to combine to distinguish between the two aspects, which have been mentioned also by Sari. When you hear strategic autonomy, you always ask yourself, from whom? I think it's still logical, and for what? And of course, it's this question, for whom, that has been discussed very emotionally, as Sari said, in the past years, also because we have had the US election right after publication of the global strategy, and much of the controversy among the member states around this term was because it was very much focused on to what extent do we need to be independent or be able to act autonomously from the US. And you could see two camps among the member states, one arguably led by France, seeing strategic autonomy as entirely compatible with NATO, as perhaps strengthening the European pillar of NATO, and also as responding to the recurrent US demands to become more active in the field of security and defense. And then you had the other camp, which maybe is not so represented on this panel, which was mostly Central and Eastern Europeans, which saw strategic autonomy very much as a threat, as a momentum to push for decoupling and duplication with NATO, and also fearing a withdrawal of the US from the eastern flank. And Germany, in that sense, has always tried to bridge the two camps. Of course, that has been quite difficult if we remember last year's comments about NATO's brain death. So we have seen also a slight tension, I think, between France and Germany. And I think we've heard that also now in the presentations that on the one hand, maybe Christoph said, we like to focus on strategic sovereignty, whereas Manuel said we actually use these terms more or less interchangeably. And now if we look ahead, of course, we have the US election approaching, and that will certainly play a role for this whole debate. But perhaps the change will not be as big as some expect. So regardless of who wins the election, we will still have this longer term trend of the US pivot to Asia, to the Pacific. And we will also still have the continued pressure on Europeans to spend more, to share more of the burden. We have seen that under Obama. And we would likely see that again if Biden should win the race. And then turning to the second part of the question, so strategic autonomy for what, which I think is actually perhaps the more interesting, the more important question now. And I think it's interesting also to see in the German Council presidency, also the German defense minister, we have often heard this term, the ability to act. We need to strengthen the ability to act in security and defense, which again does not speak about autonomy or independence or any other terms, and is perhaps a bit less emotional. But even here with this ability to act, I think we face a lot of challenges because, of course, we have this eternal problem of different threat perceptions in the member states, and that also leads to the different functional and regional priorities. So there was the survey by the European Council on Foreign Relations on strategic autonomy, looking at the different areas. And here you could see that the big divides were still the balance between crisis management on the one hand and territorial defense on the other, which is reinforced by the fact that in the global strategy, we have this notion of protection, but we don't quite know what that means, how much strategic autonomy should the EU have with regard to this protection angle. And then, of course, the more traditional geographic divides, east versus south, but also traditional versus non-traditional threats. And at the same time, we have also different perceptions on the level of ambition, for example, in crisis management, where some member states, notably also France, are in favor of enabling the EU to be able to implement higher end operations, where there's some others are more in favor of smaller scale capability operations and post-conflict stabilization. So this is an area where still the global strategy needs to be concretized, and this is where the strategic compass comes in. And the idea here is to actually provide greater clarity on what this means, what this ability to act means, and what priorities we have. And here you have all mentioned the strategic compass, and I think what we hear at the moment is really two kinds of scenarios. So there is a positive scenario where we, as I think Christoph said, we are now pushed by the geopolitical context to get real about things. So that's why the strategic compass comes at the right time, and that it will turn into some kind of security and defense strategy for the EU and really set the priorities and get the member states closer together around this joint ability to act, and then to also follow up on that with capability priorities. So that's the positive interpretation, but there's also the negative interpretation, which says, well, we are having another long winding process, which will keep Brussels and the member states busy, will lead to yet another paper. But in the end, because we have such different interpretations of the current geopolitical context, because we have these continued differences between Atlanticists and Europeanists and surrounding this idea of strategic autonomy, we will come to a lowest common denominator outcome. And in this negative scenario, the compass would not have any real influence on the ability or willingness to act. So we would not become more autonomous or more strategic. So this is just the two sides that you hear in the debate. And I think it would be really good also for France and Germany to make the most of this process And I think one of the, although it's maybe a little bit contrary to the purpose of this seminar, I would say that in this strategic compass, one should move away from meta debates on terminology and rather really focus on implementation and focus on this ability to act together, which will require answering difficult questions and also setting priorities. And that, of course, will be controversial. And I think France and Germany will have to play a key role in this process, which on the one hand means overcoming their own differences and then also getting the other member states on board.
Thank you, Nicole, for this overview, and also for bringing in yet another concept, ability to act, into the mix as well, and to also show that already at this more conventional, narrow interpretation of strategic autonomy, and when we look at developing the ability to act, that there are already difficulties in achieving this because there are different threat perceptions across Europe that you mentioned, and different priorities when it comes to crisis management and defense. So I think we really had a broad introduction into this topic already by the four panelists, and looking at the time, I think it's wise now to take some of the questions on board now as well when we do the second round, so that we get most of the questions that the participants in the seminar are asking into the discussion as well. And I think I turn now back to Manuel as the next speaker. So first of all, you can react to everything else that has been said on the panel so far, especially the comments that Nicole and Sari just made. But then I would also like you to react maybe to two questions that we have here. And I must say, some of the questions that come up in the chat are quite critical about this discussion about strategic autonomy. So one question that we had here from Jari Haapiainen, he's an advisor for the Center Party Parliamentary Group. His question is how to ensure that the important goal of strengthening EU strategic autonomy contributes to global free trade instead of possibly more protectionism, and strengthens the security, the transatlantic security, instead of possibly creating more divisions between the US and the EU. So I think the question that you hear quite often here in Finland is it that this will inevitably lead to more protectionism within the EU single market if we want to promote strategic autonomy on some of these trade and industrial issues? Or can we somehow combine it to our idea of a competitive and open single market? I think that's a good question. And if Manuel, if you could respond to that, that would be great. And let me bring in just one more question as well. There was a question by Alexandra Friede from the Federal Armed Forces University in Hamburg, and she asked specifically about the role of citizens. So how can we ensure that the citizens are included in this process of achieving strategic autonomy? And if you think is enough public support for this idea, which is often discussed in these elite circles, actually, like we are probably today. And she specifically asks also about the Central European states. So does this have the public backing in some of the Central European states, these ideas that we discussed here today? So the floor is yours, Manuel.
Okay, I'll try to be quick so that everybody has time to speak and respond. But first, I want to say to both Sari and Nicole that first, these are very helpful comments. There's a lot that I would concur with. On the terminology issue, I know that words are loaded, and it's a very good example, the panel that we have today, where you see that it's not the same expression that is loaded depending on who is speaking. What is important to me is that when we explain what we understand by the one term that we prefer, basically we say the same thing. We have these connotations that we differ upon, but if we agree on the substance, then the terminology is not so important. As I said, concepts are important. We need a good understanding of what we want to do together. But the concept discussion doesn't have to be a terminology discussion, a wording discussion. And on differences, I'm not going to pretend, especially after Nicole's eloquent presentation, that we concur with everything on everything with Germany. But I think if that's the differences between the two of us, it's okay. We should probably be able to do quite a lot together, and that's very good news. On trade, obviously, I know that there is some concern that this discussion about sovereignty and autonomy, which is not just a European discussion, which is a discussion that we see happening elsewhere, and we have example that elsewhere it leads to some kind of protectionism or trade wars or etc. So it's important to be clear about that. And absolutely, I don't think strategic autonomy or economic sovereignty or you name it should involve protectionism. One of the key issue with that is with what we're facing now is how do you deal with externalities? How do you deal with global public goods? The discussion that we have now is not, is my trade surplus or my trade deficit good enough or a problem? It's how do I deal with health and access to key equipment for the health of actually every people, not just European citizens. And there is a question which have to do on how do you factor that in global trade? How do you end fragmented value chains and zero stocks approaches that have put us in a more fragile or frail situation and have put us at risk? Diversifying your supply chain is not the same as protectionism and bringing back key activities at home, but there is a case to be made that some strategic activities need to be brought back or at least closer to home, just as we have now a consensus within the EU that investment in some strategic sectors should be screened. It doesn't mean that we don't lack foreign investments. It doesn't mean that we don't want to be able ourselves to invest overseas, but there are some things that you need to take into account. And just one more point on that, the multilateral rules-based order on trade is an important aspect on how we're going to be able to achieve that fine balance between free trade and taking into account externalities. And so the role and the importance of the WTO and of the dispute settlement body are quite important. In security, I'll be a bit quicker. It's quite easy. I know France is often suspected to prefer autonomy from than autonomy to do something, and usually suspected to prefer autonomy from the US. We know from direct experience that we need to work with the US. In the Sahel, if we don't have the US military support, our operation is really very different from what it is now. And in Syria, in the fight against Daesh, against the terrorist groups, actually it's not just different if the US pull out, if the US military pull out, we need to pull out too. Sorry, small connection issue. So I was saying in Syria, do you hear me now? Okay. In Syria, if the US pull out, we have to pull out too. So that's really a big change. But we also see, and that's a response to the question, how do you avoid a bigger transatlantic divide? We see, and that's the experience that we have for the last 4 or 5 years, being a more self-reliant, which doesn't mean self-sufficient, but a more self-reliant military partner is part of what has made France so well perceived in Washington at the Pentagon with the US military for the last few years. On public support, definitely yes, it's important on defense. I've mentioned trade. It's important on trade, otherwise the movement against free trade is going to come from our own citizens. So it's important to get popular support on these issues. And I'm not going to elaborate further. I want to give some time to colleagues too.
Thank you, Manuel. So now let's turn to Christoph, and you also get, of course, the chance to respond to everything that has been just said. And let me just add 2 more questions. One question from Ville Sinkkonen from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He works in our US program. And he asks if you could reflect on the implications of the US presidential elections. Obviously, it's a little bit the elephant in the room today. And especially he asked if you could do that thinking about the possibility for a transatlantic dialogue regarding security issues, depending, of course, on the outcome that we're going to see. So do you expect a dialogue, especially when we talk about these EU strategic autonomy aspects? So that's one question. Another question we've got is from, one second, from Antero Erola, and he asked about qualified majority voting. Of course, that's a big discussion also in the future of Europe conference, and there has been a commission proposal to move in some areas in CFSP into the possibility of qualified majority voting. Do you think this is a precondition for strategic autonomy, and do you think this is something that can be realistically achieved to have in certain fields qualified majority voting on foreign policy issues?
Well, thank you. Thank you also for the excellent comments. Thanks for the great questions. Thanks to Manuel for answering a lot of these questions also in a way I would have answered them. I just to repeat, of course, Germany sticks to the idea of a free market. We don't want to close Europe to trade. Actually, we think that international engagement by a strong European Union and enforcing our means to do that, together also with the Alliance for Multilateralism, founded by France and Germany and backed by the European Union, are all means actually to lobby for a world order based on norms and rules that allow safe interdependence that will not be exploited by others in a way we don't want to have. And obviously, Europe, together with the United States and with other partners like Japan and Korea and others, so the classical like-minded, would have a much stronger negotiation power and in order to get a fair deal with China and on WTO reform, etc. But of course, this also has to do with the attitudes towards these international bodies in Washington, and here certainly the US elections will play a role on how we can deal with that. A lot of the questions that we discuss here in the youth context, we also discuss in NATO. Just recently, we had a policy planners gathering, also the webinar. Manuel was there and I was there. And we also discussed the worldview, how the world is changing. And perhaps you had the same impression, Manuel, but my impression was that the worldview among the allies, as among the European Union member states, is pretty much the same. I think we have no illusions about how the international structure is developing. When it comes to the priority, it's a question of what to address first. And here we have very, very different member states with very different strategic interests. I mean, the strategic interest, the major strategic interest of some states is directly at the border. With a hostile country next door. I mean, Finland has Russia right at its border. Always managed this relation very well, but others have more of a fear. So the day-to-day priority is different from let's say Portugal or other countries that are far away from that, although they know of the threats in general, and supported in NATO and in the EU. I mean, it all supported the sanctions regimes, etc. So I think when we talk about the strategic compass and the exercises we will have to deal with, but as I said, not just in the EU but also in NATO, because the toolboxes will have to be coherent as well. We will have to assess how much time do we actually have to waste in discussing these things, on discussing about priorities. Sometimes we might have to do certain things at the same time, and perhaps with more funding. So I think these are indeed the questions. It will be the annoying questions in the negotiations we'll have, in communique writings, etc. But I think if we really sit together and to say, okay, how much time do we have left as a European Union? And our problem is that we are so many countries. We are not like China, that has only one party, even not just one country, but even one party. Or the United States with its system that can act more easily on all in all realms. So I think these are real questions, but at the same time they have to be overcome. And here I'm just an optimist that we can cope with that. And I think that the role of the citizens has indeed plays a role here. I mean, look on the Fridays for Future movement, where you see that people can make a difference if they really press hard for an issue. But if they vote for nationalistic governments who deny certain developments, it's much more difficult to have agreements on the EU level. So I think this is all clear. I mean, we have to deal with the situation as it is, but I think the time is running out a bit. As the time is running out, also for me, I shall have a note on qualified majority voting. It is, I mean, it's a tricky issue, and we think that we should try it in certain policy fields where it doesn't go to the guts of the nations, but where we perhaps can try it out really. So we will see how this is going to end, but we know that's very sensitive. I said something on the US elections. Well, I think we will have to work with the government we get. I think it's generally easier if we have a government in Washington that supports the process of European integration, that says, okay, if the Europeans, we need strong European allies and we want to be strong European allies. And if the United States is convinced that Europe is stronger if it's united, then this is probably helpful for everything that we want to do on the EU level. And of course, I mean, we are partners of the United States in many fields. It's our biggest trading partner. It's extremely important, and that's both ways. And of course, we have also a process in NATO running, NATO 2030, where we also need the United States. But we also have to acknowledge the United States is looking also to the Pacific. The challenges they see there are huge. And this is diverting also the attention and perhaps over time also resources from our region to others. And this is also something that we have to take serious and we have to discuss together. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph, also for this outlook on what we might expect from the future of transatlantic relations after the US elections, and to underline the need to still work together on, of course, on many of these challenges that we discussed today. So in the interest of time, Sari and Nicole, is there anything where you really want to come in? Then I can give you still a minute. If not, then I would close the seminar. But I want to give you the chance to say something if you want to react to some point, Nicole.
Yeah, thanks, Niklas. Just very briefly on 2 points, just to complement what the others have said. So the role of the citizens and to what extent do they support that? I think it depends really on which question you ask, because if you look at polls, then you always have a strong majority for more defense cooperation, above 70%. If you ask about the European army, then it's only on average 55%. If you then ask about specific operations and the use of force, then it becomes lower. So I think it really depends on the question you ask. Just to throw that in. And on qualified majority voting, so we have seen a renewed push, but obviously we need unanimity to move to qualified majority voting, even in these smaller areas. And we did an expert survey in the end of last year, which had quite sobering results, namely that only 6 member states were truly in favor of passing to qualified majority voting in CFSP, including Finland and Germany. The French position was a bit tricky because it involved combining QMV in foreign policy and on tax matters. And then there were around 10 member states that were somewhat sitting on the fence, and 10 member states that were opposed, mostly from Central and Southern Europe. So I would be very much in favor, but politically it looks very difficult.
Yeah, thank you for putting these 2 points into perspective and pointing also out the challenges still that we have in terms of public support, but also in terms of support for qualified majority voting. So, Sari, do you still want to come in and say a word?
Thank you. If I can, just 3 really short reactions. First of all, I really recognize the difficulty of broadening the concept from security and defense to other sectors, but maybe in the future we need to have a dual approach, to have both of them, to have the more narrower concept and then the broader one. Because the fact is that the broader discussion also affects security and defense, be it related to technological developments that will also affect, let's say, the defense industry and the capabilities that we are developing. Second question on whether this broader concept of strategic autonomy can create new division lines between the EU and the US. It might have the potential, but on the other hand, it might actually breach the gap. Because, for example, US is very much looking at European companies in certain technological or certain, technological fields to fill the gap that they have in their own industry to ensure the US autonomy vis-a-vis Chinese technology. So here actually can be a lot in common for the EU and US. And the third point, I just comment on the qualified majority voting. Yes, we have been forward-leaning. We want to see the possibility. We want to use it when we can, because for us, it is important that the EU is a strong global actor, and we cannot be a strong global actor if we are not able to make decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I think we covered quite a lot today, from conceptual issues about what we mean by strategic autonomy to very concrete points, from decision-making mechanisms, qualified majority voting, to different policy areas, if it's trade, if it's defense, to different also national perspectives on this issue. So I think this was very fruitful. I want to close basically with one point that Sari said earlier. I think that became very apparent. So the strategic autonomy discussion, it's less sometimes about the question of autonomy or the extreme form of decoupling or becoming independent. But what we should stress is the question of being capable of being strategic. So the strategic part of strategic autonomy, the strategic capacity to of the EU to think about these interdependencies in all these fields that we discussed today. I think this is really the key, and I think this discussion helped us maybe a little bit to think about some of these issues. I hope so, at least. And I hope that the audience will still follow a bit what also FIIA does on this issue in the future. Our FIIA project is currently writing a report on EU strategic autonomy, which will be out early next year. And also the working paper that I mentioned in the beginning will be published on our website in the coming week. So these are two publications to look out for, and we hope to just continue the discussion with all of you. But for now, I close the seminar, and I wish everyone a nice rest of the day and nice afternoon. Thank you.